So let's start. It's 5:45 high time. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to another UNIQORN invited lecture. Please just raise your hand who knows UNIQORN Association. We are pretty new. So please, this is a flyer. You might find it. Might have found it around school. So if you would be interested in our association, just use this QR code, or we are on the website of UCB. So we just organized those kind of lectures second time. This is our third time, and today's lectures is pretty special. Because it met the student conference, student conference, and also the 70th anniversary of the founding of UCT. So just before almost like 30 minutes or an hour, we might have been at the conference Catch the Wave, and I see like 3 faces here from there. You are a good one. Yeah, and it was organized just on this occasion, on the 70th anniversary. And one of the keywords of this conference was interdisciplinarity. And I can tell that during this lecture, we can somehow level up this term, because we're about to listen to a lecture on humanities and nature science here, how they are engaged. How we are engaged. And with this, I'd like to welcome here Coughlin, as we say, a philosopher who ended up in an organic chemistry laboratory, who was trying to crack the recipes of ancient perfumery. And what I'd like to mention is that Sean has 2 affiliations. The first is the Institute of Philosophy, Czech Academy of Sciences, where he worked at the Department for the Study of Ancient and Medieval Thought. And the second is Institute of Organic Chemistry and Biochemistry, Czech Academy of Sciences, where he worked in the Laboratory of Chemistry of Natural Products, if you know Ulrich Jan Group's group. So if I can say something, it's really interdisciplinary, and the thought that meet there are very, very rich, and I hope that you were just with your grateful lecture. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
That you were here.
Thanks, Market. Thanks very much for that welcome, and thanks really for coming. It's super fun. I get really excited about this stuff. So it's really fun to have people who listen to me, because everyone I know is getting pretty bored of it. So I'm going to pass out some samples. I'd like you guys to just take a sniff, pass them around. I don't have that many. Maybe I should have done some more, because there's more people than I thought. But I'll just hand these out here. Just pass them back. If you could just take that. So I'll tell you in a second what you're smelling. Some of you might know it if you have like a great aunt. Okay, so what you're smelling right now is Yves Saint Laurent. It's called Opium. It's in this stylish 70s bottle here. This perfume comes from 1977. It's not probably the original formula, it's probably a revised formulation. But it was by Jean Amick and Jean-Louis Cizek. And some of the things that you might smell when you're smelling this are going to be on the top. You'll smell some orange, some clove, and some pepper. In the middle, and some middle notes, you'll smell a little bit maybe of maybe some jasmine, some rose, I was going to say iris, but orris root. And then at the base, there's going to be sandalwood and cedar and myrrh and a musk. There's a kind of a hint of musk at the bottom of that. Now, the reason I'm giving you this is because this perfume you can't find anymore. This perfume is from 1905. It's made by François Coty and the perfumery Coty in France in It's kind of important in the history of perfumery because it's the first of what came to be known as amber accords, called for a long time Oriental accords, although now the perfume industry is moving away from the term Oriental because it's quite problematic, and they just stick with amber, which was the name of this original perfume. And this perfume, as you can see from the bottle, this is a Greek Lakouthos style perfume bottle, complete with a fair maid on the cover, which was common in Greek perfume bottles of the period, of the classical period. And so Lalique, who designed this bottle, was trying to call back to this ancient time. The name Ambre Antique is supposed to call back to an ancient amber perfume, and all of it is supposed to make us think of the ancient world, right? And it gets kind of mixed up too, because you find that a lot of what were called Oriental perfumes really refer to the Middle East and further east into India and China. And they involve a lot of products from those regions. Well, not quite, but we'll talk about that. And the time and place get mixed up. So Shalimar, which is another one here, this is made not long afterwards, and the bottle and the name and everything is supposed to be based on the gardens of Shalimar, which were made by the prince who made the Taj Mahal, right? So this is a totally different period, totally different style, but they all smell kind of the same. And the question is then, why, right? And the reality is this. Actually, there was a chemical company founded by Georges Dallaire in the 1870s. And Dallaire was a chemist and an entrepreneur, and he began kind of patenting and mixing new synthetic chemicals that were being produced in Germany. One of them you'll know. This was kind of one of the early successful products of the Riemer-Tiemann reaction. This is the synthesis of vanillin from guaiacol. Originally, first it was from coniferin, later it was from guaiacol, which is a product that you get from burning wood. Super cheap. Vanilla was wicked expensive. And if you could make it from byproducts of burning wood, you could save a lot of money. So this was one of the first products that a man named Harman and Riemer, who founded a company in Holzminden in Germany a couple of years later, were selling. And that company went on to be bought by Bayer, and then is now Symrise, which is still in Holzminden, and one of the biggest fragrance and flavor manufacturers in the world. Started by making vanillin for use in perfumery. The second example that you might be familiar with is Albert Bauer, who was the first to synthesize musk. Well, he wasn't quite the first. There's actually a really interesting story about this, but he's known as the first to patent the process for making an artificial musk. Musk, as you know, comes from an animal, a kind of fanged, like a vampire deer that lives up in Siberia. It's got these crazy teeth. It's a pretty wicked looking animal. But they have these scent glands that you process, and you extract a specific compound from this that has a kind of animalic smell that people use in perfumery as a fixative. And Bauer and also Riemer and Harman hooked up with Dallaire and gave him the exclusive rights to patenting their stuff in France and then selling it to perfumers. Now, has anyone heard the story of synthetic musk? Has anyone, so that's not a familiar story. If you look it up online, you're gonna find that all of these stories saying that Bauer was trying to make TNT, and he was trying to improve on the explosiveness of TNT. But there was a great paper that came out in European Journal of Organic Chemistry a couple of years ago where a guy just shows this completely wrong. And actually that Bauer's patent, which is 1888, predates the period during which Heusemann discovered that TNT was explosive at all by 3 years. So no one knew that TNT was as explosive as it was, and there was no way that he was actually trying to improve the efficiency of the production of TNT. He was looking to make synthetic musk because it's wicked profitable, right? That was the idea. So all of this is to say, Dallaire is at the center of all of this, and he is a synthetic chemist trying to sell his goods to perfumers, And perfumers, when they're given a synthetic musk or a synthetic vanilla, have no idea what to do with it because they're used to working with stuff like this. They're used to working with raw materials and making extracts from them, either using a kind of steam or hydrodistillation, making concretes and absolutes, and they don't know what to do with this artificial stuff. So Dallaire was really smart, and he started making what he called bases. And these bases were kind of concoctions that were easily mixed, that included lots of different kinds of synthetic scents, as well as some natural ones, that he could then sell to a perfume house, that they could then put in their perfume and sell to the public. And so this was what Dallaire did, and one of these bases that he made was known as Amber 83, and this went on to be the kind of base that was used in Cotti's perfume in 1905. This all comes back to the Greeks, because now we're trying to sell a perfume that includes ingredients that are new and synthetic, and so have none of the value of rarity that you usually associate with them because they're produced from an animal that is almost extinct, or they come from ambergris, which is really amber. The name comes from the actual material amber. We have some you can smell afterwards. It comes from a whale's intestine. It's kind of fermented whale bile that you use as a fixative in perfumery. And it's a quite rare object. And so it has none of these rare objects. It has synthetic ingredients. So how do you sell it for the same price that you were selling the other stuff? And the answer was marketing. Make it look like it's something old and valuable, and people will spend the same amount of money on it. And this was what Coty figured out, and this is what later Givaudan and all these other perfume houses started doing, and this was the birth of the modern perfume industry. All made to smell like something from before. Like a really cool history, and I really hope somebody gets into this. I'm a historian of science, but I go much earlier. I don't look at this modern chemistry. I'm not quick enough to understand all of the reactions and things. But the financial history is interesting. But this still raises a question for me, right? Which is, well, what if we could somehow reconstruct the world of past tense from the time that Lalique and Coty were trying to? And what if we could actually just start to recreate an ancient perfume? What would that be like? And this was the question that I was asked back in 2018, and this is kind of how I got into this project. A little bit earlier, in 2012, I was still doing a PhD in ancient philosophy. I was writing on metaphor in Aristotle's scientific writings and how he uses metaphor as a heuristic. At the same time, in a place called Tel Tamai in Egypt, a couple of archaeologists, Robert Littman and Jay Silverstein, were digging in a place that nobody really wanted to dig. You can see there's not a whole lot going on here. There's a town, everywhere in Egypt is basically an archaeological site, right? And so here's a place that nobody really wanted to dig, and they had set up a place there. Because they had a hunch. Its sister city, Mendes, was famous in antiquity as the capital of one of the Egyptian provinces. And this was a province that had a separatist movement. They actually broke away from the Ptolemies for a while, about 100 years, and had an independent industry going. And that industry was wine and perfumery. And they had made perfume that was famous throughout the ancient world. And these guys thought maybe there would be a perfume factory there. And in 2012, they found something that looked like it was actually a processing plant for liquids. And in conjunction with this, they spent some time trying to get the residues of some of the amphora that they found tested. National Geographic gave them some funding. And then in 2018, National Geographic was planning to put on an exhibition about the queens of Egypt. And of course, just because of the way society is, if you think of Egyptian queens, you think perfume. And so they wanted to have perfumes at this exhibition. Robert and Jay asked Dora Goldsmith, an Egyptologist at the Free University in Berlin, who brought me into the project to work on recreating an ancient perfume, because I had been in touch with Dora about a project I was working on in the history of cosmetics. So this is how I got involved in this. And that paper ended up coming out last year in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies and Near Eastern Archaeology, and it had the unfortunate title of Ode to Cleopatra, which was the head of the dig. That was Robert's idea, but what are you going to do? It's correct time period. Whether she wore it, I don't know. We'll smell it in a minute. But there's a kind of interesting thing that happened at the end of the last decade, which was that all of these things about scent started coming out. And people started getting interested in it. And then in 2020, when the pandemic hit, a bunch of people who happened to have scent projects in the different evaluating committees, like the Czech Grant Agency or like the ERC, got funding. Usually scent projects don't get funding, right? Because, again, it's the kind of society we live in. But these ones got funding. And they got funding because scent, I think, was on people's minds. You know, the evaluating committees were thinking about the fact of anosmia that was concurrent with COVID. And so, you know, these stuff started to come out, and people were more open to it. Barbara Huber at the Max Planck published a paper in Nature Communications outlining a kind of process for reconstructing ancient scent from residue samples that she found. And actually, if you look at the kind of media that people were covering our story about the Cleopatra's perfume, and they started writing about how we recreated this perfume based on the residues. That's one from the Smithsonian in 2019. Here's from Hyperallergic this year, because these come in waves. And they always say this, right, that they say that we got it from perfume bottles. We found it using the residues. And of course, this is completely false. We didn't have the residues. They had found amphora with residues in them, but we never got the samples done because COVID hit and the permits weren't being given out. So there were no permits to get the residues. So how did we recreate it? I'll talk about that in a second. But that's the assumptions that we always start with residues. And now you can see why people would be interested in scent and why they're starting to become interesting in scent, the kind of defenses people give in the interest of scent. One of them is the kind of immediacy to human existence of smell. Smell, people might know, is a kind of the one sense that just goes right past your thinking brain and straight into the limbic system. Connects directly, so the moment you smell something, you're reacting before you can even think about it. You're not consciously acting, you're just reacting. And this shows you how important biologically this was to human evolution. It is tied to memory and to really what we are. Second way that scent is important is just in terms of trade. Not only Simrise or Harman and Reamer or any of these other companies, but in the past, I mean, you think of the spice roads. These were roads that were constantly moving goods from one place to another. And not just precious metals, but often these were spices that were used in perfumes and food, because that's where the most luxury money was going to be found. It's also the place where you can really easily adulterate if you want to make more money. But that's another thing. And the third place that you find it, you know, scent is really important in culture, in the history of culture, in the history of religion, in the history of science. Basically every religious festival you can think of involves an olfactory component. And as we'll see in a little bit, the history of alchemy and the history of perfumery are uniquely tied. And so they really actually form the kind of ground for the chemistry that a lot of people practice today, whether you're aware of that or not, in terms of the instruments and also in terms of the kinds of procedures. So that's kind of what's at stake. You know, this is why we would want to reconstruct a world of past sense. But the problem is that we actually can't. And so what I want to talk about today is why we can't. First of all, why we can't recreate the past. That might seem self-evident to people, but everyone always keeps trying. The second thing is what we can do if we can't recreate the past. And then I'm going to take a look at some of our experiments that we've been doing in this project, Alchemies of Scent, which we just started last year at the Czech Academy, where we are trying to work with 5 ancient perfume recipes to see what they can teach us about history. But before we do that, I want to start with some smells, if you guys don't mind, just to get people like a little bit, let's say, thinking about scent. These will smell a bit alcoholic at first, obviously, because these are all dissolved in alcohol. You take one of these. I won't tell you what they are. You'll have to think about it. Some of you might know right away. Please. Yeah. Can I pass this one to you, and then maybe you can pass it over to the other side? So do we have any ideas about what this one is like? You might say some names. does anyone have any other notes they might add? You could say it's floral or green. It's a bit spicy, like it's got a bit of heat on the nose when you smell it. Sorry? Yeah, it is. So this is lavender. The name lavender comes from the Greek word luein, which means to wash. Lavender was typically associated with clothes washing. It's where its name comes from. It's the flower you clean with. Okay, so that's one. But really, when you're smelling it, the aim isn't really just to smell it, to identify it, which is what chemists do a lot of the time. And that's a really important part, actually, of the history of chemistry is figuring out how to use noses in order to figure out what things are. But think a little bit about what it smells like to you, and not just what the thing might be. Okay. Okay, I'll take it back. This one might be a bit trickier. Does anyone have any impressions? Not names, don't tell me what it is, but tell me what it's like first, before we jump into what it is. Orange. It smells orange to you, that's what it's like. Yeah. Lemon, citrusy? Limene, yeah. Does anyone have anything a bit more subtle? Like, does it smell like a big orange you get at Christmas time? Like a big sweet orange? No, it's a bit more bitter, right? When I smell this, the first thing that comes to my mind isn't the kind of drink you see here, right? Which everyone usually associates this with, but it's Coca-Cola. This smells to me like Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola has a lot of neroli in it, which is orange blossom, which is that kind of citrus flavor and Coke comes from. But this is actually, this is bergamot, for those of you who know. It's this small little woody-looking orange, a dwarf citrus that's used in Earl Grey tea, famously, but it's also used in a lot of cocktails, and it's used extensively in perfumery. I'm going to do one more, if you have the patience. Wait, not this one. Okay. This one's a bit more subtle, so you probably won't, after smelling the bergamot, it might be a bit harder to hit you. Pass that one around. Please. Does anyone have any notes for this one? Woody. You smell woody. What's amazing for this one is that a lot of people that I know here, especially at IOCB, and maybe it's a thing just in IOCB, a lot of people when they smell this, they say they smell mushrooms. No. But not champignon, right? Like they don't say they smell champignon, they say they smell mushrooms like when you're out in the forest, in the morning, the mist is settling. That's the kind of mushroom it smells like. You might say it's warm or balsamic. Those are the kinds of things that people normally associate with this. A bit spicy, maybe a bit sweet, maybe a bit astringent. Let's leave it. Okay, so we're going to come back to that one. So I wanted to say a little bit, because I've been talking about ancient perfumery as if we all know, and we're all really close to the subject, and I understand that a lot of people probably don't know much about perfumery in general, or ancient perfumery especially. So let's just talk a little bit about the world of ancient perfumery. Now, the world of ancient perfumery starts, as far as our records go, it's prehistoric, as far as we could tell. But our records suggest it starts around 3,000 years ago. And this is mostly in the Middle East. In Mesopotamia, we find who's often called the first chemist, which is Taputi. And we call her the first chemist because we have a recipe from her that describes the process of distilling herbs, where the distillate would condense on a pot, and then she would wipe it down with a cloth and wring it out and obtain the hydrosols this way. So that's the earliest example of distillation that we have. And you know, the Greeks come later, but for the Egyptians, this land here, the Horn of Africa, what they called the land of Punt, was where all of the aromatic resins came from. This is modern-day Somalia, Ethiopia. And the Greeks, it was basically all of Arabia. They thought that everything came from here. Herodotus talks about the fact that cinnamon, labdanum, myrrh, frankincense, all of them come from here. Of course, cinnamon comes from over here. And it's just that the Greek traders encountered it there for the first time. And that's how the markets kind of work. The same reason, it's Thanksgiving in the United States today. And a turkey is a big bird that people eat at Thanksgiving. And what's it called in Czech? What's a turkey in Czech? What is it? But that's not related to, is that related to a country at all?
No, not at all.
Not at all, that's okay.
Coincidence. No.
Because in French, right, it's a dinde, which means it's from India. And in Portugal, I think it's called a Peru, like from the country Peru. And in English, it's called a turkey, because they thought the animal actually came from Turkey. There was just absolute confusion after Columbus where everything was coming from, right? So it's the same thing in the ancient world, right? Like a lot of things have changed for us now. So that's the kind of world of ancient perfumery. This was the land of the sun, the land of Helios and the god of the sun for the Greeks. And you know, the sun and the heat that's required to produce the resins like this, because these trees only grow in these regions, is deeply connected, both for the Egyptians and for the Greeks. And the way perfumes, we find them used, first is, you know, we find it often in festivals, but usually actually just as a kind of skin protectant. If you're living in a very arid climate, moisturizing, protecting the skin with scented resins was actually quite common, or just using oil without any scent, but quickly people wanted something. And in fact, under Ramses III, one of the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, I think, there was a strike in Thebes, the same place where this funeral fresco is from, where the workers went on strike because the food wasn't good enough and because the oils, the scented oils, weren't good enough. So they were worth striking over, right? These were things that you were supposed to give to the citizens. And here's Ramses III over here, and he's burning some incense. He's not smoking a pipe. And this is a kind of traditional incense holder they hold, and they used incense in religious festivals for two reasons. One is as an offering to the gods, but more importantly, it's as a way of making the place that you're in a space where the god wants to enter. So you think of possession, you think of like divine possession, you want a scent that smells nice in the room, but not just nice, ritually nice, whatever that means, so that the divine can come in because it's like their house, right? Like you need to make it something like them. It's the same reason they would put ointments. The Egyptians would make ointments and put them on statues in order that the gods would possess the statues. The same reason we see ointments in witchcraft, right? Which I'll talk about in a sec. Another place when these ointments showing up is in medicinal contexts, and thank goodness, because that's actually where all of our recipes come from, other than religious contexts. So in the religious context, we have them inscribed on funerary inscriptions, and in ritual walls in temples. That's the only place we have. The papyrus scrolls are gone. But the Greek medical texts have survived, and they included these because they were considered to be medicinal aids. In the same way that tiger balm is, right? There's just a long tradition of this. Another place you find it is in symposia, drinking parties, festivals, and they actually drank perfumes, which you might think is strange until you realize that Coca-Cola has bergamot in it. So you're basically drinking perfume every time you have a soft drink. That's where these were medicinal perfumes that you drank, right? So there was a lot of criticism about this in antiquity, but they were big party things. And finally, witchcraft, which connects to another aspect of perfumery, which is that perfumery is really about transmutation. Witches would put perfume on in order to become something else. This is Pamphile in the story of the Metamorphoses, written down by Apuleius. And she's putting on a perfume in order to become an owl to go fly away to her lover because she can't find anybody in town that night. So she needs to change and get away somewhere fast. So this is about transformation. Apuleius himself puts an ointment on, thinking that he's going to become a great animal, and he becomes a donkey and then spends the rest of the book walking around Greece as a donkey. So this is the kind of connection with these. Witchcraft in Greek is also known as pharmakeia, which is the root of our word pharmacy, and a witch was a pharmacist, if you can believe it. So anyone who's studying chemistry, basically you're just practicing witchcraft. Just to say a bit about perfume, the word, you may know it as coming from the Latin perfumare, which people will often just say it means through smoke or something. It's bad etymology. Whenever you see per at the beginning, it's an intensifier. It just means that you really smoked something well, so it smells. And people would smoke their hair over a burning set of incense in order to perfume it. You would perfume clothes this way as a kind of body spray. They didn't I guess, incense things the same way that we do. But the thing is that perfume, in this sense, doesn't show up until the Middle Ages. There's no Greek or Latin word perfumare, perfumum, or anything like this. This is a much later invention. What they said different words, but basically in Egyptian it was senecher for incense, or thumiama in Greek, incensum, that's kind of incense that you burn. Elion is an oil, and a myron or an unguentum is a perfume. And when we say unguentum and elion, the way we distinguish these is one is an oil, and the oil simply has the flower in it. It's just kind of a simple ingredient. And the myron is a complex thing. It's got lots of different ingredients. Often it's more like an ointment than a perfume, than something liquid. And we'll say a bit about this as well. Okay. Now I want to get back to the typical story of how we're supposed to recreate an ancient perfume. And the typical story goes something like this. First is some people, this is the guys at Alchemy. Normally there's some archaeologists, if you're watching TV, this is the story. There's some archaeologists and they're at the dig site and they find a bottle and they get really excited and they look inside and there's something in it, and then they give it to some scientists, and the scientists will then science it, and if you're watching a National Geographic documentary, the lights will go kind of dark and you'll be in a lab with backlighting, and it's all very exciting. And then there's the product that you get at the end, right? Like it's just a tricorder reading out what it is. Now there's really a lot to say. This is not necessarily wrong, but I want to say that there's three big challenges for this story. And the first we can call the world is different problem. And that's this, that the materials that we have today just aren't the same as the materials that they had in the past. And I'm not just talking about the raw ingredients, like the stuff in front of you, but also equipment, methods. We just don't know what they were doing, and we don't have them anymore. To give a famous example, in Libya, there was a food that everyone used. It was a spice called silphium. It was so well known that the city in Thebes and Cyrene actually put it on their coinage. And this is it here. We know that it probably was a kind of ferula. Here's what a ferula looks like. Dill is a ferula, galbanum, like there's lots of these things. But none of these things like has the kind of aphrodisiac, incredible flavor that silphium was supposed to have. And this went extinct in the 60s because we are told that Nero, the emperor, was given the last stalk of this stuff. So it only grew in this area of Cyrene and in Libya, and it was given to Nero when it went extinct. Some guy recently just said he found something like it growing in Turkey, but it's, who knows? So that's the problem. We just don't know. And it's often not just these kinds of things that go extinct, but because of just human agriculture, things change over time really quick. So we just can't say that the things that we have now are the same. And even if the materials were known to be the same, we couldn't know that we reproduced an ancient scent. There was a great study that came out 10 years ago from a lab in Pisa, Colombini's lab. What they did was they remade a 17th century ointment per the instructions. Had about 5 or 6 different ingredients in it. And they gave it to 11 labs. And they said, use whatever analytical techniques you want. Tell us what's in this ointment. Only some of the labs were able to give approximations of some of the components, like, oh, it contains a wax, or it contains a resin. but they weren't able to specify exactly what species, right? Even genus was quite difficult, and only a few got a couple of the genera. But none of them got all of the ingredients. So even if we were able to follow the recipe knowing that we had all of the stuff that they used to have in the past, we wouldn't be able to know that what we end up with is what they had, because none of our analyses could take a residue from the past and tell you what's in it, because we can't even do that with modern stuff. Never mind all the degradation that's going to happen to something after a long time. Finally, even if we could know we'd reproduced an ancient scent, we wouldn't understand what it means. Okay, so I just want to pass this around a little bit and just take a sniff of this and maybe tell me what you smell. This is the last bit I have of the Mendesian we made for National Geographic. It's old now, so it's not as strong as it used to be. It's really weakened out. So what this is, according to the Greeks, one of the most sensual perfumes ever made. This is something that it's like, one of these perfumes, right? It just sells sex. Now, when I smell this, it smells to me like a Christmas donut, right? Because it smells like oil and cinnamon. I don't have the same associations with this as one would in antiquity.
And
so,
the rancidity in that is nature, or?
Yeah, that'll just tell. Yeah, because this is probably from 2018. So this is now quite old.
It's not the part of the
No. That's just it getting old over time. Yeah. They would make perfumes every year and usually would refresh, right? You wouldn't necessarily keep them for a long time. Some of them kept for a really long time, but not most of them. So, the associations that we have with the different ingredients have changed so much that even if we were to create a perfume, actually accessing what this meant to a culture at that level is really difficult to do, maybe impossible. So those are the three challenges that I raised for this. The world is different problem, the reverse engineering problem, and the distance problem. We're just culturally distant. And it's not like being culturally distant today where we could go join another culture and talk to them. These people don't exist anymore to ask them the questions. So what can we do? Well, I want to suggest that we can start from recipes, and that's what this talk is about, and that's what this project is about. Recipes are kind of like scientific papers, right? They record somebody's interaction with the world in a very specific way, where they're trying to help you do the same thing again. They're trying to make a repeatable event and trying to record things in a way that allows you to do that. So if we assume that recipes are like this and can be replicated if we have the right kind of knowledge, and we assume that the laws of chemistry haven't changed, that basically the world is the same as it's always been in this sense, maybe the materials have changed, but at least the way chemistry works hasn't changed, then I think we have a place to start from. Now, normally, when one writes a recipe or writes a scientific paper, you have something that you've produced, and then you record your methods of doing it, and then you give it to somebody else and they perform it. Now, when they want to check whether they did it right, they can ask you and they can compare it, right, with the, they can compare it with the thing that they had at the beginning. You can do this check. You have a target, you know what it is. Now, the problem that you find a lot of people doing when they study ancient recipes is that they will assume that once they just go through the recipe, what you end up with is what the recipe is for. Now, anyone who tried to make bread during the pandemic and saw, like on YouTube, this beautiful loaf and saw like the heel of a shoe in their oven knows that you can't just follow a recipe and end up with what you're supposed to. It actually takes a lot of work. And if you don't have the target to check, then you're kind of in trouble. You're not going to be able to actually figure out whether what you have in the end is what you were supposed to have. And if you just assume that what you have at the end is what you're supposed to have, well, that's a kind of a fallacy of thinking, right? Like that's called begging the question in philosophy. It means you're just assuming your conclusion to be true without the evidence. You said, I did this, and that's what I ended up with. And you often find a lot of people, when they replicate a recipe, will say, oh, it's so weird that in ancient Egypt, they thought cinnamon was sexy. It's like, well, maybe it didn't actually smell like that. We don't have the target, so we don't know. So that's why I think, biggest problem is this, that there's lots of different targets that this recipe could be for, and we actually don't know which one it's supposed to be. So what can we do? Well, this is the solution to our project, which is that actually when we're trying to replicate the recipes, we're trying to experience the kind of chemical reality they had in front of them when they were working with similar kinds of materials. And we're not trying to reproduce scents. We're not trying to make the targets like perfumes. We're trying to get more objective targets that they specify in the recipes. Like, when I did this, I ended up with an oil that was more receptive to scent. Or when I did that, I got a perfume that lasted for a really long time. And then we can start to translate those things into chemical terms. What does it mean for an oil to be more receptive to scent? What does it mean for a perfume? What does it mean for an oil to be such that a perfume will last a really long time? What are the kind of chemical necessary conditions that need to be met for that to happen? And then we can start to figure out what the recipes were doing. And we actually can fill in a lot of information because we do know something about how they made perfumes. This is a wall painting at the house of the VŠCHT in Pompeii, luckily preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius. And in this painting, we have some kind of interesting scenes. One of them, which is just from a cultural history perspective, quite fun, which is that they're putting perfume on the wrist, which is where people often dab perfumes. And the explanation there was that the perfume goes on the wrist because the body's heat will less likely destroy it. Actually, we think the opposite. And Pliny tells us they put it on the top of the wrist and not at the bottom of the wrist to explain that, right? This is a cooler part of the body than this. So perfume is still going on the wrist. They would also put them on the neck, so the kind of placement is similar. But I'm more interested in what's going on in the middle here. And in the middle, we see these are all cherubs at the center, producing a perfume, and they're doing two different kinds of tasks. We're going from right to left in this sequence. And on the left-hand side, my left, your right, is a process called stipsis, and that's a heat procedure where they treat the oil with a lot of different natural compounds and heat it and then let it cool. And then in the second case here, they're doing a kind of bapsis. If you've ever been baptized or heard of baptism, this is the same word for dyeing or for dipping things. Here they're taking something and putting into the oil they've prepared. The oil is cool, and so you're not going to lose any of the scent compounds, which makes you wonder what they're doing in the first stage. But in this, they're just macerating, or they'll use enfleurage, these kinds of cold techniques for preserving aromatic or odoriferous compounds. So we have this, and we have texts that confirm that this is actually how they work. There was a heat stage and a cool stage to perfumery. But this last word, and actually the first word, this mordanting I put up there, the stipsis procedure, brings us actually to the connection between perfumery and alchemy. I don't know if anyone studied the history of alchemy, but alchemy is the science where you're supposed to transform a metal, base metal into gold. That's how it came to be known, but actually alchemy began, the Greek word chemeia just means to pour, and it actually came from an ancient art of learning how to make artificial things, like basically dyeing metals to make them look like gold, dyeing stones to make them look like emeralds and rubies, and in the same way, an analogous procedure in perfumery, making an oil smell like a rose and not like an oil. These are all arts of dyeing, where arts of dyeing are kinds of transmutation. They're arts of change. It's basically just chemical change, which is what they were doing. And actually all of the kinds of instruments that they're using are very similar to the types of instruments that chemists still use. This is a medieval manuscript, but it's got ancestors in the 3rd century BC, and it shows the distillation of mercury and the alembics, the different types of apparatus that they're using for producing the mercury. Here we have a little stove, this chemnion, and here we have a vessel where the mercury is contained and then it distills in the condenser here. And in perfumery, even earlier than in alchemy, we find distillation apparatus. This is Levet in 1955, kind of reconstructed. This is controversial, but what we have here is a pot with a pot that goes on top. And you see how there's this, this ridge. This is the bottom pot as well. There's a pot that goes on top of it that fits into this ridge. And the condensate collects in this little ridge here. And then they'll pick it up with the kind of sponge, as I was saying, like taputi. So the idea is basically the same as a sock slip extractor, which we have here, right? Which is, it's just really not that different an apparatus. We have the bain-marie, which comes from Mary of Alexandria, a woman scientist, alchemist from the 2nd century. It's named for her, and it was a kind of way of controlling the heat in a way that you couldn't with an oven the same way, right, where you just have fire. This makes sure that we're working with lower temperatures, the type of thing perfumers themselves would actually be interested in. We're at the lab, and just to say, like the tepegare apparatus really is no different from this, where you collect the condensate in here and then pipette it out, right, instead of actually collecting it in a separate vessel. So not only do we know what the procedures are, but actually a lot of the apparatus that we use in perfumery in chemistry today is really just descended from the kinds of apparatus that they were already using 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. So if we're trying to wonder like how far is our world from them, maybe we're culturally far, but in terms of technology, like the root technology, we still use the same things. Just like in cooking, you still use a pot. In chemistry, you're basically using the same stuff. So we're not that far away. So I could say that there's these three responses then to those challenges that I raised earlier. First is that, the world isn't actually that different if we just focus on the processes that they're engaging in. And that experience can actually add to our evidence of what they were doing. We have knowledge that can help us with the reverse engineering of the processes. And we can understand the techniques they were using because we still use a lot of those techniques today. Of course, we have many more processes that are far beyond what they were capable of doing in terms of precision, but the rough and ready stuff, controlled application of heat, and basically trying to separate liquids using it is something that people have been doing for a really long time. So that's the kind of basis for the project that I have at the Institute. And like Mar was saying, it is quite interdisciplinary. We have two different groups of teams, like two different teams basically who are working, and one is a philological team, and they work on trying to understand how to interpret the different recipes, perfume recipes, and then on the other side, the scientific side, natural scientific side, we have botanists, archaeometrists, and organic chemists who are working to then experiment with those different interpretations. So we'll take a procedure and we'll offer many different not too many, but we'll offer many different dimensions for the study to go in, and then the organic chemists have to design experiments. And then we just go back and forth off of each other. This model comes from the history of alchemy. No one's tried to use it in perfumery before. For obvious reasons. It's much easier to tell at the end if you've gotten something that looks like gold than something that smells like something that Cleopatra would wear. So we've had to modify this procedure in some ways, but focusing on the process, I think, is the most reasonable way to do it. So the first step that we do, as I said, is to gather our data and our materials, and this is the philological team that does this. Basically, we look either at inscriptions in temples or in text, and we put together a lexicon of perfumery, all of the different words, and all of the different things that they might mean. So take, for example, myrrh. Myrrh is something that has many different meanings depending on what culture you're in, what time you're in. The actual identification of the stuff sold as myrrh as a specific species, Commiphora myrrha, is only about 80 years old. Before that, we didn't actually know what this product was. People just used it. So in addition to making sense of all of the different words and mapping them out, we also do the same thing with materials. We actually just go around buying resins from all over the place and trying to create a kind of a material lexicon that we can experiment with. And after that, we have our chemist team who then works to design experiments to test these, and I'm going to talk about one in particular. And then we compare those results in the end with the historical record and with the results from archaeometrists who've actually studied the perfume residues to see if there's any similarity, just to see if that's a route that we can take, because we don't want to close that off. And over 5 years, we're looking at 5 different perfumes. Other studies who have done this, usually their selection criteria for the perfumes are, was this a popular perfume in antiquity? Our selection criteria were more about the processes that they were involved in. And we go from a very simple procedure at the beginning and iteratively get more complex as we go along. So we begin with just mixing a gum resin, which is this stuff, in water. And we've actually, maybe it's a bit sad, we've been working on this for a year and we still haven't gotten it yet. Now I'm going to show you why. But this is to make something called VŠCHT, which is a myrrh perfume. And it was actually the simplest perfume in antiquity, only one ingredient, just myrrh. And somehow this is supposed to turn into an oil without distillation. And we have no idea how they were able to do that. So that's the first step. After that, we're working on refining oils, where we take this oil, or this oil. It's called balanose oil in the ancient world. We don't know what it is, actually. It could be one of two things, we think. And this is said to have been heated for 10 days and 10 nights, and afterwards becomes more receptive to scent. And so we're trying to work with the chemists to translate this word, more receptive, into something that's chemically real. What does that mean for an oil to be more receptive? So then we design experiments to say, well, what if it meant that the volatile fraction is gone, and so it loses its smell? Or what if it means that you destroy any of the kinds of compounds in there that might turn into aldehydes and make it smelly? Something like this. So there's lots of different ways one can interpret this, and we're testing them out to see if cooking it for 10 days leads to any of those results. Then we're working on 3 more, which I won't get into, but you can ask me about if we have time. Okay, so I want to go back to this thing that we were smelling earlier. Does anyone know what that was that you were smelling? So this was myrrh, which is also this object here. It's Commiphora myrrhae. This grows in Somalia and in Ethiopia, and also across in southern Arabia. It's a tree resin. The tree usually exudes this resin when an insect bores into it. It makes a little hole, and then the tree will fill in the hole with this resin, and it's also got antimicrobial, antibacterial properties to stop it. It's just full of terpenes, right? So this is what myrrh is. It's the different kind of soluble fractions of it in different solvents is probably about 100 years old that people have been throwing around these numbers. We're not sure if they're still right. I actually have just learned that bitter principle is something that's used in chemistry as a term that I'd never really heard of, but it just means things that are bitter to the taste and we don't know what they are. So there's about 25% of myrrh, but you see that it has actually a lot of gum, and the gum is just sugars. And in this way, it differs from a lot of other things, which has been quite important for our experiments. Okay, so our first experiment that we've been working on, just to say a little bit about it, is an experiment for this mixing resins with water, and this is to produce what's called VŠCHT. And I'm going to show you guys 3 of the recipes, just to give you a sense of what the recipes look like. This tree goes with the name that you're about to see for it. It's recorded in the temple in Athribis in Egypt. And this manuscript describes it according to Theophrastus, who's Aristotle's student, who also talked about VŠCHT. And these are the recipes. This is my translations, our team's translations, so they're a bit weird. But if you read the Egyptian one, it says, dry antu. Antu is the Egyptian word for myrrh, whose name is Mesha'ib. It is myrrh from Kamati land. It came forth as a fluid of Heket. Its color is likewise red. It is soft inside as its beshesh, which we think might mean liquid. Its scent is fragrant, and when it is pressed through a bag, then the internal besh is 1/4. When it's pressed through a bag, this was quite fun. But so you imagine this is supposed to be myrrh, and if you imagine pressing this in a bag, and you're going to get 1/4 of its weight, volume, I don't know, in liquid, how does that make any sense, really? So that's the first problem. But then we go to Theophrastus, who says, from crushed myrrh, again this stuff, flows an oil. For it is called VŠCHT because it drops little by little. When the myrrh has been crushed and dissolved with a gentle fire in balanose oil, they pour warm water on it. Then the myrrh and the oil settle on the bottom like mud. When this happens, they strain off the water and squeeze the sediment with an instrument. We don't have bag, now we have an organois, just the Greek word for instruments. But what's really strange is that the oil and the myrrh both sink to the bottom of the water. You might think that's a bit weird, because doesn't oil usually float? The next one, this is from Dioscorides a couple hundred years later, who writes that VŠCHT is the name given to the oily part of fresh myrrh after it has been crushed with a small quantity of water and pressed with a tool. It is very fragrant and expensive, and it is on its own the perfume called VŠCHT. It is of excellent quality when it has not been mixed with oil. So take that, Theophrastus. We don't want any of that oil mixed with it. We just want the straight beshesh, or whatever it's supposed to be. So if you look at these three, we can make a kind of synoptic chart of these three recipes. And the Egyptian one is obviously the one with the least information for us. It just says that the mesha'ib is pulverized, and then it's pressed in a bag, and then you get a liquid. We get Theophrastus telling us a bit more. He actually gives us this really intricate procedure where you crush the myrrh, and then you liquefy it with balanose oil, then you douse it with water, then it sinks, then you filter it, and then you press it, and then what you get is stock tea. And then Dioscorides says the myrrh is crushed with a little bit of water, it's pressed, and you get stock tea. So we have some areas where things are similar. We get some similar, crushing things, pretty normal procedure, anyone who's worked with spices. But this idea of pressing it is also what's consistent. And that it's supposed to be somehow getting a liquid out of something that is quite solid and usually not considered to be terribly water soluble. Now, some questions that you have immediately when you see a recipe like this is what is myrrh that they're talking about? Because myrrh refers to lots of different things. It could be like different commiferous species, kataf, or it could be mirha, or it could be guidotii. We're not really sure which myrrh it is, and they all have different properties. And we don't know which ones the ancients would have preferred. They talk about different myrrhs, different qualities of myrrh, but they don't associate them with species because the concept didn't exist. So we don't really know which one it is, so we have to try all of them. That's one of the problems. And actually, if you go through the recipe, we get lots of different, all in red, these are all of the items that, the philologist side says, we don't know what this means. We have a couple of ideas. Can you scientists test it for us and figure it out? And the scientists say, do you know how long that's going to take? That's a lot of different variables. So we need to then start to kind of figure out how to simplify and get to the principle of what is actually going on. And that principle is basically that we have a substance that is a tree resin that is somehow liquid and being crushed and pressed, and we extrude that liquid. Right. So that's what we've been trying. Just to say something about the instruments, we do have some information to go on. This is a wall that's in the Louvre right now, but you can see the relief has women making a lily perfume. You can see it's a lily perfume because on their head are these baskets of lilies. And lily perfume is a typically Egyptian perfume, and it's one we're going to be making the 4th year. Actually, we're going to have somebody in Prague grow us 4,000 lilies so that we can then make a full-scale replication of this. But what they're doing here, this is the Egyptian word for lily, and this is the Egyptian word for tern, arf. And they're arfing this bag right here. And so the lilies have been soaked in oil, presumably, and now they're being squeezed by a rotating bag press and put into this pot. So this is the kind of bag that we might be familiar with in the Egyptian text, and that the Greeks wouldn't be too familiar with, and so might just say instrument. So we have that to go on. We didn't do that. We just we got a dental press. It was more convenient than trying to use a linen bag. And we tried the recipes out, right? And one of the things that was really interesting was that as soon as I showed this recipe to the chemist, he said, well, look, they're probably not pressing a liquid out of a resin. That's crazy. But what they might be doing is they might be kind of making the resin that's already there a bit softer. And if you make it a bit softer, if you reconstitute it as a liquid, then you might be able to get some more volatiles coming off of it. And if you don't know anything, you might just say that it smells more now. You've gotten a fragrant liquid out of something that wasn't as fragrant before. So maybe that's what they're doing. And this was really interesting, and this is why talking to chemists is so helpful. There was a pair of Egyptologists in the beginning of the 20th century who looked into this problem. No one's looked into it since. One of them was Albert Steuer in Vienna, and he said, he made the connection between the Greek and the Egyptian recipes, and he said, well, this seems like a reasonable procedure, and he said that it must have worked. And then Lucas, who was the kind of top Egyptologist at the time, said, look, I've taken resins and squeezed them and I didn't get anything. And besides, doesn't oil float on water? It doesn't sink, right? And then Lucas responds by saying, well, maybe they had a resin that had a higher concentration of essential oil. And I believe that this must have been an extraction procedure for the essential oil of myrrh before distillation. Lucas says that's crazy, the conversation ends. No one's picked it up. We did it. We took this and ground it up in a little bit of water and put it in a bag and put it in a press. And we actually get a really sweet smelling myrrhy liquid. You can take a look at it afterwards here. And it actually stays liquid. It doesn't solidify, again, as long as you keep it closed. And it doesn't stick when it goes on the body, so it actually make a pretty reasonable ointment cream. It smells like myrrh. The smell lasts for quite a long time. If you're into myrrh, and this is a simple compound or simple uncompounded perfume, this might be it. So we had actually thought we cracked this one really easily. And then we started distilling the myrrh just to have a comparison. And what we noticed when we distilled the myrrh was what the oil sank. So apparently it forms a kind of complex with the water, and then unless you dry it out with magnesium salts, the volatile fraction actually will stay below. It's more dense than water. So this was unexpected. So the Theophrastian thing that says the oil sinks to the bottom, we can't rule it out anymore. And then the other thing we were doing, we were working with our press, and we thought, well, why don't we just do the Egyptian one and just press the raw oil, or sorry, the raw resin. And when we did, we have a very small, it's a very small scale, right? And when we did we actually got, not insignificant amounts of liquid that came through when we pressed it. And not only that, but when we cracked the myrrh open, you can actually take this liquid right off of the surface of it. So the resin, because it's mostly sugar, forms a kind of crystalline structure, but there are fissures inside that contain a substance, and we just did FTIR analysis on these. So we're going to have the experimental botany pick them up tomorrow and run Headspace to see what's in them in terms of the olfactive component. But in terms of the major components, it's just missing the sugar. So it's really just the myrrh essential oil as a liquid. And you can imagine, if you have a lot of slaves and a lot of time, somebody can go through with a little spoon and scoop out all of that liquid, which would make sense why it's very expensive. And you could just do a very slow manual extraction of myrrh essential oil. Why not? So that was a result of these. We have a better sense of what the materials are capable of. This is a sense where, working together, we have some really interesting proposals. Nothing quite nailed down just yet. Over the next couple of years, we're going to do more experiments. As I said, we're starting now with oils, where we're trying to figure out how to make an oil more receptive in the same way. Cooking an oil for 10 days and 10 nights to somehow make it usable in perfumery. And then we're going to get into the process of stips, where we're mordanting the oil in order to make it take on the scent more properly. That'll be the year after next. And just to say one more thing that we're doing, because we're not, in terms of interdisciplinarity, we're not just working with chemists and humanities people, but we're also working with playwrights who are trying to teach something about the culture of ancient perfumery and about just ancient scent culture in different ways. And so a troupe performed the story that's told in Ovid about the birth of myrrh, and I can talk about that if people are interested later. And we also are engaging in a bit of citizen science, where we have workshops and we get people to come in and actually produce the perfumes with us, and we teach them the kind of basics of interpreting a recipe, give them a variety of materials, and let them do their own interpretation and take it home with them. I have a couple of examples here of what those are like. And then the idea is that they give us updates on what they've done. How did they change? What do the smells are like? What are the smells that are predominant over time? These types of things. Just kind of diffusing the work of what we're doing. So that's it for my talk. I thank you guys a lot for your patience. I know it was a long one, but I do have a part 2. If anyone wants to smell things and taste them, you're welcome to come down to the front and we can go through stuff. Otherwise, I'm open to any questions that you have. So thanks a lot.
Okay, so I don't know how to do it now. You can go down there and smell what you want. Also, you can ask your questions. First questions, okay. Questions?
What's the oldest recent book?
Say that, sorry?
What's the oldest recent book?
The oldest. Well, the oldest recorded recipe we have is the one from Naputi, who's the Mesopotamian perfumer for a king. So that's the oldest recipe we have, and that is in the 3rd millennium, so it's about 2000 BCE, about 3,000 years ago. That's the oldest recorded one. Obviously, people have been using oils on the body long before they were recorded, right? Because they were already quite sophisticated. So I'm pretty sure that perfumed oils, scented oils, have been something that people have been using as long as we've been basically cooking with oil.
Can we track out elements of the mummies if we look for the artifacts?
That's a great question. So, the problem, you have people who say that, a lot of these things still smell after a long time. They still have some volatiles in them. So you can go to a mummy and it will smell of things. But whether it's going to accurately represent what was originally there is a totally different question. Because we simply don't know how these materials age over time. So if it smells like something we don't know if that's what originally smelled like. The second problem is that, so myrrh is one of the most common ingredients listed as a component in mummification. And there have been only questionable and basically no studies at all that show the presence of myrrh in any mummies. And that means one of two things, that our identification of myrrh for Antu, or for the other substances that they were using, is wrong, or that we're looking for the wrong thing, because there are degradation products that we don't know about, that we're missing, that we need to be looking for. And that's a huge gap that should be filled.
Actually, I found very interesting one thing. First, what crossed my mind as a question was if there's any evidence that they preserved smell scents in the past times. But actually, I found out that I don't know how we preserve scent today. I mean, in the perfumery industry, is there any kind of preservation method or something like that? But in the ancient times, what I think is that when the perfumers were learning how to prepare perfumes, they needed some, model the model, something what they were trying to get close to, like in terms of scent, in terms of smell. So was there something like that, and how's it nowadays?
So I'll start with the old world, because I know it better, but I mean, it seems that there were two ways that the knowledge of the scents got transmitted, right? Like what a thing smelled like was, if you're talking about preserving like what the scent is as a target, right? Is that what you mean? Mm-hmm. So this would be, I mean, usually you would have an industry where you don't tell how you make the thing on pain of death, basically. It's like trade secrets. Now we have non-disclosure agreements and courts. Back then they would just kill you if you expose the secrets of the factory, right? So the idea was that your father taught you, usually it was passed down this way. This lasts all through the guild. You would just be producing things the same way. And like wine, it wouldn't be the same. What made it what it was kind of where it was produced. Now there's a place in the Osmothèque in France where they preserve all of the different formulations for the perfumes. And since synthetic chemistry, it's been a lot easier to preserve the kind of consistency of results. Before, again, perfume was like wine. If you had a bad harvest of myrrh that year, you had bad myrrh perfume. If the roses were ruined that year because of an infestation, you had bad scents, right? So this was, every year there would be a new season of a perfume coming out, just like every year there's a different vintage of wine. Now, in terms of preserving, just chemically preserving, the way they preserve the volatiles from escaping was that's a different question. So is that what you meant? Which one, I guess?
Yeah.
So this one they use alcohol, usually, and they'll use ambergris. They use different components as fixatives for them. But so they use alcohol, which is quite stable for these things, and a lid. And that's what kind of keeps them from evaporating quickly. Whereas in antiquity, they would use the same thing. They would kind of keep things closed, but the oils that they used would often go bad, and you would just buy the perfume again the next year. If you wanted a perfume in the ancient world, you would often go to the apothecary, and they would make it for you on the spot, using, mixing things up. So that was another way they did it.
Okay, but I can imagine even though, like cases, for instance, as you mentioned, if I didn't misunderstand, the incense as the attractants for gods.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Yeah. So might be there, or were there also like perfumes that should attract to gods, and if there were, the recipe or just the final product, the final perfumes should have had the same
yeah. Yeah, it's
and it's like for everyone, you know, it's not like my brand. I need to attract the god.
Right. So because the problem I think is if we think of perfume as too much as one kind of thing instead of looking at it as just scented compounds that we use. You don't want to confuse things you wash your body with the things that you preserve for the gods. Just as if, you know, if one goes to different types of religious institutions, they often have special perfumes, like chrism oils, or they call it the myrrh oil in the Orthodox Church. Like they have these oils that they use for special occasions, produced once every 10 years by a bunch of monks or priests in a specific area. And those are specific to those places, and they pass those traditions on. So again, in those places, there were priests who were responsible for preserving the tradition and keeping things going. The same in Egypt. The reason why in the Ptolemaic temples, and this is the Ptolemaic period where the Greeks had conquered Egypt and were in charge, they're starting to now make inscriptions on the walls of perfume recipes that used to be transferred for over 1,000 years by scroll, right? Like papyrus scrolls were where these things were put. And they actually just wrote them on the temple walls as a kind of nice wallpaper. Like the idea was, this is a sacred place, we put these, but they weren't using the temple inscriptions to make the perfume. They had the book. It's just that the book is lost. And we have the temple inscriptions, thankfully. So in that sense, the priests would keep that knowledge by copying the text over and over again, and by teaching the next generation how to make the same thing. In the same way that most of these kinds of crafts have continued forever. That's why it's so difficult now, because the production of perfume was with Coty and with Dallaire and with synthetic chemists of the late 19th, early 20th century. Those traditions were basically stopped because there was just no profit in it. So you very rarely, unless you find communities where people have been making perfumed oils for a long time, you really find a consistent lineage of production that you can then go to as a model. Those arts are just gone in the same way that we've lost a lot of old ways of doing things.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I would have a question. You have shown some of the literary sources where it was evident that the source of Theophrastus is quite relatively complete in comparison to the Egyptian source you had mentioned, or the later Roman or Hellenistic writers. It's quite often the case that Theophrastus has the main information and Pliny and all the others just copied the information from Theophrastus. But on the other hand, in some cases, the early Arab sources contain some interesting new information and concerning this specific field of perfumes. That there is, I think, Alchemies.
Yeah.
From 800. Will you consider this Arab source in your project, in your research?
Yeah, so that's actually, this is the direction that we want to go next. We're focusing first on this project focuses on the exchange between the Egyptians and Greeks, and we focus mostly on sources of the period. We go to later Byzantine and Arabic sources to help us, right, to read back. I'm not an Arabist, and I don't read Arabic, so I can't access these. But the idea next is to take it to the transition from the Greek world to the Arabic world, where these texts are translated into Syriac first, then into Arabic, and precisely to end with Kindi, where we have the first book of modern perfumery, the distillation of scents using the bain-marie, right? Like this is absolutely revolutionary. And so we want to see like, well, what was leading up to this? We have some Byzantine recipes that involve a crude distillation. And so, you know, we're trying to figure out what were the conditions that allowed Kindi's genius right here? Like this is what we're trying to figure out. Yeah, but that's the kind of where we would like to go with this next. Yeah. Thanks.
I have a quite similar question about the historical sources because I don't assume that Cleopatra, even though he was a poet, really understood deeply into the process. So I think that there can be like a lot of mistakes in the recipes you are trying to reconstruct. Especially I think what oil means, for example, for him. For us, it's it has some maybe broad definition, but for us, we know what oil is. But for him, it would be just some oily substance. That's one thing. Also, like the top layer and the bottom layer, maybe he would just mistake these two, etc., etc. So I think in the original recipes there can be some mistakes that you encounter when you are trying to reconstruct the original recipe.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's the idea of having try to find as many independent witnesses. So also the idea, right, that everyone's copying Theophrastus, that's not good. Because then you're just looking at the same mistake being repeated over and over, right? So we try to find independent witnesses and then see what those independent witnesses have in common. So with the Egyptian text and Theophrastus and Dioscorides, based on the way that they're writing, we know that these are independent witnesses to some similar procedure. And we try to then just abstract the principles of what they're doing. And basically that is finding some kind of a liquid that you can use as a perfume in that stone-like thing by pulverizing and pressing. That's what's similar. And so then we have to try to do a lot of interpretation. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Theophrastus is really interested in the process because Theophrastus's work on scents probably is part of his larger botanical work. And what he did in his botanical work was to divide the plant world into two types of operations, the operations of nature and the operations of agriculture. And saying that, look, some plants produce what they do on their own. Some of them require human intervention, and the products that they produce are different depending. And so the work on scents actually comes out of this study of what are the human effects on plant products. So it's basically organic chemistry. So he's really precise about the procedures that he's recording because he's asking, ultimately, why does this happen? What is the reason for this effect? Why does an oil become more? He gives a very expansive explanation why he thinks when you cook an oil for 10 days and 10 nights, it becomes more receptive. Or why when you do a mordanting, as he calls it, a process to the oil, why does that change an oil like olive oil from something that can't take a scent to something that can? And he has an explanation for this. But it's just using his kind of, it's a different it's hard to call it chemistry, but we'll just call it that for convenience. It's a different system of explanation of chemical change.
I just imagine like a non-chemist, like someone random person coming to the lab and observing us working.
Yeah.
And then trying to describe it or to make an essay about it. That would be total nonsense. Nobody would understand what we are actually doing, especially before working with some specialized instruments or substances. So
what about if a physicist went into a chemistry lab and tried to explain what you were doing? That might be more, or a mathematician, right? Like it's something like this. Like, I mean, Theophrastus and Aristotle weren't dummies, and they certainly had just invented a system of explanation, and that was actually quite new, how to explain causes of things. So they had a kind of set idea of what they wanted to do, but the system of explaining things in terms of hot, cold, moist, and dry, or in terms of porosity of things, we might think that these are quite wrong. But they were the best that they had at the time, right? So as long as they give an explanation in those terms, maybe we can then start to recover a little bit about what they might have been experiencing. Just as you imagine someone coming into a lab and experiencing what you're doing, you think maybe it would be really hard to recover what I'm doing from their description of it, right? They're saying I'm heating some vials over a heat gun. And maybe you're trying to do a really complicated synthesis, and this is one stage in there, and I'm just like, he's heating up a piece of glass, right? Like you're not going to be able to recover anything from it, which I think is that's your point, right? It's just going to be really hard to fill it in. Yeah, so I take it, but we work with what we have.
More questions? Maybe I would like to say that after the lecture we are going to grab a beer with Sean. We have a good table for 15 people, so I think that most of you are more than welcome. So we can join us and you can discuss it with Sean more deeply. But now, questions? I saw a hand there.
So perhaps let's let me comment on the scent of Cleopatra. So what was the scent of Jesus?
What was the scent of Jesus? It's just frankincense and myrrh and whatever gold smells like, I guess. I don't know. No, I mean it's a question. I don't know what. I mean we have some descriptions. It just depends how you want to answer that. We have some descriptions of scented oils that would have been used at the time. It's not too far off from the stuff we find in Egypt. Actually, there's a lot of crossover between what we find in most of the Mediterranean cultures in the Eastern Mediterranean, and so they're always using usually types of resins in their perfumed oils, roses and other types of flowers you find usually more in European northern Mediterranean contexts. But in southern Mediterranean, you usually find resins, and then a lot of the spices that we have here. So labdanum. So there's a famous incense called the Ketoret, which is mentioned in Exodus, has 4 ingredients. One of them is stakti. At least the translators of the Septuagint translated as stakti. In Hebrew, it's nataf, which just means to drip, and there seems to be a connection. And there's an assumption that this is myrrh oil. Another ingredient of it might be labdanum, but we don't know. Another one might be galbanum, that's often put forward. So you can smell them if you want to, like they're down here, but those are basically the ingredients that would be there. They're usually ferula, ammoniacum, and boswellia, comifera, these types of resins.
Is this a medieval or ancient map?
It's a medieval ancient map.
Oh, nice.
Everything ancient's medieval. Basically, everything is not. If it's not a papyrus, if it's ancient, it's medieval because the originals are all gone. So we just have the medieval copies. But this is a medieval copy of what's probably the Periplus, which is an anonymous text that describes sailing around the Erythraean Sea, kind of like going around the world, and that's based on this map and on Ptolemy. Yeah, it's quite cool. Eh? Like it's just a totally different way to see the world. Also, just to see like these places where they just don't know what's around. I like this, that there were just places in this world that used to just be terra incognita. It's very different to just try to enter into what that mind was like, really.
Well, I would have one more question. How was it with using of musk for human body? Was that used or not?
Did these humans smell? So there's a couple of, like medicinally, we find recipes that look for the scum from the baths. So if you think of a public bath, there will be scum that appears on the sides, or when you empty the water, there'll be scum on the bottom. Doctors would collect that, or people would collect that, and they would use that as a medicinal ingredient. And then there was another one that was quite popular where the men who wrestled covered in oil. That oil would get mixed up with the sand and then would form an oily sand mixture that would be left, and the doctors would collect that and they would use that as a medicinal ingredient as well. So yeah, I mean, it was pretty common.
What did you mention, like women's, females smelled than male, but so was it common that they collect the smells in the oil or?
No, but I mean, not really, because people usually, I mean, men wouldn't want to smell like women, usually in the ancient world, and I'm not saying that there was actually like and so that, you know, this is a generalizing statement. Let's say in a kind of more careful way, you have a lot of critiques of perfumery in the ancient world, just as you have today. Perfumery as being effeminate, and anything related to women is bad. It's part of one of the reasons why perfumery as an aspect of science isn't really taken, as part of the history of science, isn't taken seriously. There are a whole lot of arts connected with goddess of Venus, or generally with women, like dyeing textiles and making jewelry, things like this that are just kind of rejected from the history of science. Only alchemy seems to make it out as something. But even that is an art that's associated with women at the beginning. And there's really interesting questions about why.
Sorry, but
yeah.
I'm not speaking about ancient Greece, right? Or
this is about ancient Greece, yeah.
So it was excluded from, like, because women...
So, no, men were not allowed to be, so men couldn't sell perfume in Athens for a long time. It was illegal for a man to sell perfume. If you were a citizen, it was seen as an uncivilized activity, not manly. Socrates, in Xenophon's Memorabilia, it's a work written about Socrates by someone other than Plato. Socrates says that men shouldn't wear perfume because they should smell like olive oil and sweat. That's a manly smell, and that's enough. And women don't need perfume because they smell great, or they're old, in which case they don't need it because they're not sexual objects anymore.
Okay, but what about
that's,
the bath and oil?
No, so we could, yeah. So this is, so there's a real hostility among the conservative intellectual classes against perfumery. Meanwhile, in Athens, all the young men are hanging out every day at the perfumer's shop, as if it were like the pub. They just went to the perfumer, they would hang out there, smell the new things, rub it on each other, you know, like it was a totally different thing. So you had the old men of Athens saying perfume is terrible, and all throughout, like people who were recorded, right, like Cicero, all the way up through Pliny the Elder, like these guys hate perfume. They're just like, oh, this stuff is so womanly, And then, meanwhile, all the men are just out there putting on perfume as much as possible. So we get like really mixed, if we look at like our sources say like, the ancient world hated perfume. Of course they didn't, it was really popular, but it's just these conservatives really didn't like it. So women, I mean, but it is true that, you know, in that sense, humans create their own odor. And so you wouldn't really need to put it on because you have it with you naturally. And actually they thought bodily odor was quite bad. And so they did notice that human odor could be quite pungent and unpleasant, so that we needed things to cover it up. And that's where these oils come in. And they just, you know, it's different perfumes for different people. So men typically wore floral perfumes, according to Theophrastus. So like rose and lily were typically men's perfumes, whereas women liked perfumes that lasted a lot longer. So myrrh and other like heavy resinous perfumes. How well he knows this, I don't know, but that's what he says. Yeah, no problem. Did you have a, sorry?
Yeah, but you already answered.
Okay.
So maybe we can invite you.
Yeah, please come down. It's not, I just want to show you guys a few things. I have four little things I wanted to just let you experience a little bit, just because they're quite, right? You can pick up whatever you want here. But I have like the raw ingredients and the essential, like the essential oil. The essential oils are commercial, except for the myrrh. That's the only one we've done on our own. This is the stuff. This is just myrrh mixed with water. So myrrh has so much sugar in it that it actually solubilizes quite well. And you get a hydrosol. You can get a mixture of the two. And this is what everyone at IOCB says it's like mushrooms, but I don't smell it still. Yeah. Okay.
But first, when I smell it, it's like soil.
Right, it's earthy. It's very earthy. Yeah.
It's somehow with the mushroom, with forest.
This is I don't know if you've seen this one before. This is galanum. This is used in a lot of perfumery today. I can show you what it smells like. I just get some test. And you can see how different the essential oil smells from the raw ingredient. Feel free to like crush it up. So galbanum is actually it comes from Persia. It's a big like ferula. It's a big like dill kind of plant. And again, when the insects dig into it, they exude this resin. And the resin is used as a top note in the perfume called the metopion, which is one of the ones that we're working on. And we know it's the top note because it's something that you don't cook. So whenever they had the two processes, one was a cooking process where you will lose most of the things that smell, and the other is the maceration or the enfleurage. So this is what galbanum smells like. It's used in some perfumes now. It's quite common as a top note. It's very metallic smelling. Yeah, just move around, and I can take a couple of these, dip it in. So the name the metopion comes from what at least Dioscorides tells us is the name for the plant in a language that we can't identify. This has been a consistent problem. We're talking to a lot of South Arabian experts, like in South Arabian languages, and in old Ethiopian languages like Cushitic, because a lot of these names aren't Egyptian and they're not Greek and we have no idea where they come from. So metopon is one. It's certainly not an Egyptian word. We don't know where it comes from. We know that this is, as I say, it's an Iranian plant, so it might have entered Egypt when the Persians conquered, but we don't know. Here's some more of this galbanum if anyone wants to smell it at the moment. The nuts. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So it's resin from a tree, or
different species, but yeah.
What is this?
So this is the metopion. This is the perfume that has this is one version of it. So we have two. These are both two different ones that people at the workshops put together that they didn't take with them. So I don't know if you want to smell the galbanum. Please, yeah. Do you smell galbanum? Do we? Well, I guess I just say we are now. We're not occupied. Because the person who took the position, yeah, we still have a position. So we do have so we will be reopening. We had a call for a PhD student who will be working in the project. It's a part-time position. It will be in a kind of collaboration between our project half-time and working in chemistry of natural products with ULI half-time. And the idea of the PhD position is for someone to identify a component that's distinctively ancient perfume, like we go through the recipe and we compare it with basically essential oils and whatever our steam distillation products are, and find out what might be a distinctive odorant in an ancient perfume, and then synthesize it. And so then come up with a way of synthesizing it. So that's what the project is, and we'll be announcing the call again. So.
Would you perhaps have some advice for the children?
Because I don't have really run of the lab. It has to be with Uli, but I can ask him and see if there's because people apply for bachelor stuff in his lab, so we can definitely look into it. Yeah.
Like in the organic part.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
IOCB is world.
So yeah.
Sorry.
That's a concern these days.
No, sorry.
No, not at all. Okay, so this is the galbanum. Could you hit the next slide? Yeah. Okay, so the next one is frankincense, which I think people know. Cadidlo. There should be. Yeah. So cadidlo. So frankincense, we're told by Herodotus, who's a historian who visited Egypt, and he says that frankincense grows on trees that are surrounded by winged snakes. And when he says winged snakes, you kind of wonder what he means. But he might, there might be a story about cobras, and he might be looking at wall paintings where you have like stylized cobras, with looking like they're winged. Or he might be thinking of dragons. But anyway, the tree's protected. And Pliny later on says that the reason for these crazy stories is probably because the sellers were trying to make more money, right? So if you say, oh, I had to fight off these winged snakes, you're way more likely to get more money than if you just say, I bought it from this other guy and adulterated it so I can rip you off. But so the frankincense, you can smell it in the, where did it go? It's somewhere floating around. But if you smell the raw ingredient frankincense, it's very familiar. It smells like, well, to me it smells like my going to church when I was a kid. But it smells like lemon. It's got a little bit of limeine. It's quite unique as a resin. This is the essential oil. Like this is the hydrodistilled stuff. It smells quite different than the raw ingredient, actually. Does anyone know where the? Oh, here it is. That's Stackia, lemongrass. Does anyone know where the frankincense? Well, here it is. So that's the frankincense resin. And this stuff we're told by Herodotus was protected by these snakes, but then they would burn something else called styrax to get the snakes out of the way. All of these things are still used in modern perfumery too, right? Like none of these things have changed. Styrax is the stuff where styrene comes from, and polystyrene it's the root of this product, natural product. Yeah. This is the styrax. So this is what was burned in order to get the snakes away. This is styrax resin. And if you want to see this is just actually styrax in alcohol. This is the actual resin. It looks like tar. It smells like gasoline. So it's like it does smell quite a bit like gas. But this, I was actually told by someone who works with these that this, although it was sold to me as authentic, like a real styrax, this might actually be the South American variety of a similar plant, but not the stuff that we would find in the Mediterranean. And then the second last one.
Like glue, you know,
yeah.
Forest palm oil.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not super pleasant. There is cinnamon, which is seasonal right now. And you'll know that there's usually two varieties of cinnamon that you buy at the store. One is a cassia, cinnamon cassia, which is usually sold as Chinese cinnamon, or it's much spicier, much warmer than true cinnamon. Cinnamon only comes from Sri Lanka, from Ceylon. Which is why it's called cinnamon verum. Sorry, it's quite. Watch your fingers on that. Don't get your fingers too wet. This is true cinnamon. This is quite nice, but you can see that that's it. Yeah, that's it. That's the same thing. So that's the raw ingredient. So these are all hydrodistilled. You can see how much hydrodistilling really concentrates the smell, right? And then when this gets mixed in a perfume, it's going to go back down to really trace amounts. And I've also I tried to show a couple of different varieties of things here. So we have in a lot of ancient perfumes a type of resin from Pistachia species. Pistachia are the ones that produce the nuts that you eat, right? But they're also famous for the turpentine resin that was used. And colophony is a kind of dry resin that people use for like rosining bows and violins. It's used for waterproofing, and that comes from the fractionation of this resin. So when you heat this, you collect turpentine resin, which is used as a paint thinner, and then the solid stuff that's left over is you use for applying as a resin to things afterwards. And so this is turpentine, but you also get lots of different kinds. This is from the island of Chios. It's also Pistachia in Greece. In Chios in Greece, they chew this as a gum. You can actually, if you want to take some, you can chew it, taste it if you want to. And you can taste any of these things, but some of them aren't really good. This is a Pistachia from Iran. This is Pistachia kinjuk. And you can see it comes out liquid. It doesn't come out in tears and then solidifies later. And then this is, that's oil. This is another Pistachia. This is Pistachia atlantica. And it comes out as a liquid and then it stays liquid for quite a long time. And it's really sticky, so don't get it on your hands. But it smells beautiful. So again, when they talk about resin, they just say retine in Greek, and we don't know which of these resins they were using. It could also be pine resin. It's just a general term, and so again, it will depend on the perfumer, the region, what kind you're actually going to end up with. So we need to abstract to kind of a general, what are the components of resin in general to help us. And then the last one that we'll look at is myrrh. So the story from Ovid about myrrh goes something like this. So Myrrha was a princess, and she was a princess on the island of Cyprus, and she pisses off Aphrodite, doesn't worship her well. So Aphrodite curses her to fall in love with her father. And now Myrrha is really torn. She was in love with her father and she wants to die. Her nurse says, please don't kill yourself. Sorry, if anyone's sensitive to this stuff, tell me. I can stop telling the story. But just to say, it's quite a shocking story. But so her nurse will convince her not to kill herself and to say that I will hide you away until the evening and then you can sleep with your father. And she does that for 12 nights. And then her father finds out on the last night and wants to kill her for this. And he chases her south all the way across Arabia down to the bottom where they can't escape anymore. So if you imagine the map. Basically we're starting up here in Cyprus and we're going all the way down to the bottom of Arabia. And there she has nowhere else to go. And so she cries out to the gods, like, my father's chasing me, he wants to end my life, please save me. And she's saved by the gods who turn her into a tree. They turn her into the myrrh tree. And she cries tears, and those tears harden, and they harden into something very bitter. So the idea of myrrh, and the myrrh is here, and if you have some water to chase it with, you can taste it. The myrrh is actually incredibly bitter. It smells quite sweet and quite nice, but when you taste it, it's intensely bitter. And the idea of the myth, right, is to capture this as something that is seductive and sweet, but then when you actually taste it, it's quite bitter. And the word mir actually is a Semitic word that means bitter. Like that's the whole root of this thing. Is it something that tricks you? Now, from Mirha, after she was turned into the tree, 9 months later, comes a son, who is Adonis, the most beautiful man who was ever born, who then traps Aphrodite and ends up causing her trouble, right? So this is the cycle for the myth. So those being reasons I wanted to talk about. There's also lots of these other ones that are just kind of styptics. Yeah, please, yeah. So there's lemongrass and calamus, sweet flag. And these are usually used in the initial processes. And all of these, again, these are all still used in perfumery. You can't trace the ingredients being used quite long through the tradition.
It smells a little bit like Christmas muffin.
Doesn't it? It's oily and cinnamon and a bit...
Jak jsem začíná rozpouštět, úplně uhořký a nechutný.
It's myrrh and cinnamon. So this is simply 1-to-1 myrrh and cinnamon with some resin in it.
Tak to fakt není dobrý, protože já kdybych ho chutnal asfalt.
To jsem nikdy nedělal.
And this one's quite. So this is what a lot of people think that the perfumers were using. They often call this perfumer's myrrh, and it has a compound in it called beta-ocimene, which has this really distinctive smell. It smells almost like caramel. It's really sweet. It is not found in the myrrh at all. And if you compare that with another of the myrrhs, which is the Commiphora kataf, I don't know where that one's gone, but it's almost like a black stone. It has no scent really. It's quite inoffensive. And then if anybody wants to smell, does anyone want to smell ambergris? This is the whale vomit that they use in perfumery. It's quite potent. It's got a lot of ammonia in it, right? Like it's quite.
Yes, it does. That's disgusting.
Yeah. So the animalic ones are usually, they're usually tied to like fixatives, but they're also just they're used in perfumery because they smell like an animal, and sometimes that's just what you want to smell like. It's fine.
What is the black stuff? The black asphalted stuff?
Oh, this is labdanum. So this is from what's called a rock rose in English. It's Cistus genus, and it's. So the way that this stuff used to be collected is that the goats would go out into the field and they would eat the rock rose, the cistus, and they would get this all over them as they were traipsing through the meadow, and then the farmers, the shepherds would brush it out and then collect it. And it's one of the hypotheses in Egyptian iconography. You often have this guy with a beard coming out, and it's supposed to, maybe it's like a goat's beard where the goat has been out in the field, and so it might be a signal to the labdanum. Labdanum we can trace to South Arabian languages as a root, so we know that this is a South Arabian language term. And then these are the oils, yeah. So this is they use usually a couple of oils, but the ones that in all of our recipes are this. We got this from this is Balanitas aegyptiaca. It's like a date. I see if I have a picture of it here. Sorry. So that's on the right in this basket. So that's what they look like when they're dried. Yeah, so there's almond, exactly, yeah. So the bitter almond, the topion that gets confused for an almond oil at some point. But so that's the desert date, that's what they look like on the right. And they, it smells quite nutty. Like, it's not like a good perfume oil. Something has to be done to it, right? Because it smells too strong. The other oil that they use is this green olive oil. It's called amphakinon. It's called omotribes is another name. It's oil pressed from unripe olives. It's very green because there's a lot of chlorophyll in it still. And somehow this was preferable for perfumery, and we don't quite know why. They would rather use this than a ripe olive oil. We're not sure about the differences in the constituents. And then this is Moringa olifera, which is another oil pressed from another type of seed. All of these oils have they don't rancidize easily, so that's what's quite useful about them. But they all have these are all cold pressed, they all have a distinctive scent that would need to be gotten rid of right before they can be used.
And how much is this piece of amber?
I don't know, because someone donated it to us. I don't know how much it is. But I mean, it's not super cheap, but I don't think it's as expensive as it used to be. Because synthetics have pushed the prices of a lot of these things down. No, but synthetics have pushed it. So amberine is now synthetically produced, so the demand isn't so high. But like ambergris and the amber perfumes all arise because they were based from this compound, not the amber, the resin, fossilized resin. No, it's not terrible. And the other thing that was kind of fun, does anyone see they use a lot of cardamom in perfumery, and it's actually still used, like just things that you wouldn't think, which is why, you basically just eat and wear all of the same things. But cardamom is still a major mid-note or sometimes a top note in perfumery.
It's a good for salad, but I'm not really sure.
Yeah, it doesn't. It's not. It's a bit bitter too, right?
No, I like it actually.
Yeah? Like the taste?
No, I didn't.
Oh, you didn't taste it? Okay.
Is it safe? With like a
I mean, they're not from a chemistry lab. So.
Oh, so it's good.
Yeah, so they do, and they actually eat the nuts as well. So this is.
It's quite quality oil.
This is the desert date oil. It's not olive oil. It's a bit, yeah.
Okay.
This one is, I don't know if you guys know this one, sweetgrass. It's Acorus calamus. It's the root, it's like the rhizome of a reed that grows along the Nile and some other rivers. And it's used, they used to put it down it's called sweetgrass because they used to lay it down because it had a kind of nice odor to mask the scent of people, just generally. And then they use this in perfumery, and again, it's not so common anymore, but it's still used often.
And do you use like opium?
I didn't have black opium. I just have the original formula because black opium kind of does a lot of things with it. It takes it away from the more kind of traditional amber. This is calamus. It's one of these one of these components that goes at the beginning in the cooking stages to make the oil somehow more receptive. But it's just a really common note in perfumery.
Are you eating it? No.
You don't eat the calamus because I think that it's not good for you. It's got some toxins in it.
And may I ask what is in this?
That's the Shalimar. So this is another. Sometimes I show one or the other. The Shalimar is made by Guerlain. It's one of their like big top perfumes that came out in 25, I think. It was their big entry into the amber perfume market. It also uses, I don't know if it uses amber 83, but it also uses some synthetics. So the first synthetic perfume that we know of was called Jiki by Guerlain. It was produced in 1885 or something like that. And it had synthetic musks from Bauer. It was the first perfume to contain these synthetic compounds. And then Guerlain's grandson, another Guerlain, made this simply by taking the original formula and tossing a ton of vanilla into it. And you find a lot of these amber perfumes, which were called Oriental, have vanilla in them. It's usually quite strong as a base note in them. And vanilla is a South American thing, right? Like it doesn't come from the ancient world at all, so it's another one of these. But it's a beautiful scent, right? So, and sometimes you can smell a bit of vanilla in some of the resins, like especially in pine resin. If you ever go out in the forest and just take a piece of pine resin off a tree and just kind of warm it up a little bit, it does have something like vanilla in it. I'm not sure how close it is chemically, but it really smells quite similar.